All right, we can go.
Welcome to the Postgame. Welcome to the Postgame, everybody. Michael Brooks here, along with David Griscom and Matt Leck. Folks, we got a bunch of stuff to get to, but first, without any delay, let's play the second half of this great conversation with Roden, Burt, and Shaw. Whenever you guys are ready.
Yep.
All right. You all right, David?
Yeah, I'm fine. I just, when he's playing the music, I can't share it. So.
Oh, okay, cool. Oh, okay. Yep. Sorry about that, guys. I don't know if I went too quick. Okay. This is about another 20 minutes, and we'll come right back with Ben Burgis. Yeah, that's totally true. So I want to we'll get to Starmer and Biden in a few minutes. But, I mean, Ross Douthat has a column in the New York Times today. And, you know, it's very disturbing because in the sense that this is he's a smart guy, but he's not only is he a right-wing guy, I mean, he is his base of politics is culturalist politics. In his case, I would say reactionary culturalist politics. But his read on the moment, you know, he's extremely perceptive about where things could quite easily go with the uprisings that we have in the United States right now. And he, you know, to his credit, I mean, he soft pedals it, but he says, look, I understand that there are some people involved, and I would say most people involved in Black Lives Matter uprisings have a connection between these issues of police violence and racism to income distribution, to capital accumulation, to the redistributive policies that need to go along with the defunding and uprooting policies. And he says, you know, that's there, but what I see as a more likely outcome is basically that and this is what Adolph Reed outlines, that this is sort of like there will be greater representation in elite ranks. Of course, relative to not representation, greater representation is better than not representation, but it is not at all an uprooting of the fundamentals of power and distribution and class dynamics in a society. It's not going to have any agenda for the masses of people who, of course, still overwhelmingly mostly are people of color, but also people of every single background who are seriously suffering in this economy, and they'll only suffer more as the kind of fundamental trends not lock in. And he said, you know, there will be a sort of changeover in discursive strategies in elite institutions that will affect kind of like woke sort of frameworks. There will be, more kind of HR politics. And this can also breed into the various kind of like moral panics and toxicities and, complete antithetical to solidarity that we see in social media. It's disturbing to me because here's a guy that does not have our politics at all, one way or another, I think much more accurately discerning the dangers of where we're at than a fair amount of people, in some parts of the left. So, and then on the other extreme, I just want to say, I mean, we just had a conversation before with William Shockey. Last weekend, we talked with Sean Jacobs for the Jacobin, and there's absolutely this other parallel in terms of the enormous potential of these uprisings. However, if they go the direction that Douthat has outlined, then we have like a kind of another maneuver away from structural politics. And, that's, and he framed it as, Bernie's second defeat, basically, that this is like the next bottle up of any kind of sort of mass-based solidarity.
Yeah, I saw the piece. It was interesting. I mean, on the one hand, when the right produces pieces like that, you've always got to ask what kind of fissures within the left are they pressing on.
Right.
But a lot of what he says, as you point out, is a one potential future here. It's one potential road that these protests could go down. That the defeat of Bernie Sanders, or say in Britain, the defeat of Corbyn, means that the kind of social democratic politics, the economic politics, and the structure of politics moves off the pitch. And what you get instead is a kind of return to some of the NGOism, return to some of the representational politics and things which are much more trapped within the safer sphere of liberalism. That's one potential, which is why, in my view, one of the lessons we have to learn from Bernie and from Corbyn is about how we're building coalitions. On what basis are we building these coalitions? And, in what sense do we imagine them? Both Bernie and Corbyn represented a vision of a majoritarian politics. This idea, which is actually fundamentally the most important question of socialism, is the idea that our politics is about representing the majority of people who work for a living, who rely on their wages to live, against the minority of people who own the economy and use that, therefore, to run society in their interests. That is the only real power that we have, but it is a real power that we represent this working majority. And that question has to be at the forefront of how we build coalitions, whereas some of the kind of ideas that had come out of the left, particularly in the periods of defeat that became really dominant in the 90s and 2000s, were this idea that instead of focusing on what our power is, our ability to put together a majority of people and to build solidarity within that majority, that what we will do instead is simply pick a whole series of categories of minority and try to stitch those together and focus on actually the powerlessness, focus on the oppression. And it's almost a patrician attitude from above for a kind of middle class left that will look down and say, well, who's put upon, and okay, we'll support this group or we'll support that group, instead of the working class or the proletarian kind of idea of what the left is about, which says, no, we will deal with questions of anti-racism within a class and socialist movement by saying, if you are happy to allow, black workers to be treated in this way by the cops, well, then it'll be them today, but it'll be you tomorrow. And in Britain, we have a very, very clear example of this, where we can point to the Orgreave disaster, the Orgreave tragedy, where the miners were beaten the hell out of during the miners' strike by an organised and paramilitarised police action in Britain. As an example of, this is what happens when the police get out of control and when they believe that they're entitled to do what they want above and beyond what should be within their powers to do. When you have systemic police violence, this is what it produces. And when you have a kind of a system where racism is so thoroughly built into it, well, then what might today be racism against one group will be racism against another tomorrow. And so for Irish people now, the very same headlines that we see in the press about migrants, asylum seekers, particularly Muslims in Britain today, well, they were the headlines written about us in the 80s and in the 70s, and this is the way in which we have to build solidarity. We have to build an understanding of a collective struggle, rather than a struggle that can be siloed into all of various different groups and managed, to be frank, much like the kind of the Irish in Britain tried to manage our struggle in the 70s and 80s, where you had, if you wanted to deal with the Irish, you'd go to the priest, and the priest would tell you what was basically acceptable or not, or you'd go to the building magnate, and the building magnate would tell you what was acceptable, whereas the Irish lads working on the building site, or the Irish people who were being abused by the church, were having their voices completely written out. Instead of a situation like that, where you have all these little community groups that are all in their own silos and creating spaces for, career progression for very small numbers of people, we need to have a struggle that unites people who are fighting for a different kind of society, that can put together a social majority in the interests of real change, obviously, in my view, in the interest of socialist politics, but at the very least, a common program that talks about structural economic change, that talks about the deep injustices in our society and how we're going to tackle them. And that does it not by focusing on the points at which people are powerless, but focusing on the thing that gives us power in society, which is the fact that we are majority of people. which is the fact that we are representing a hated, a despised, we're up against a hated and despised ruling class who own the economy in ever greater amounts. So smaller and smaller proportions of people, 5%, 3%, 1%, 0.1%, owning huge proportions of our economy without any legitimacy in terms of the narratives they're even trying to put forward now on how they're entitled to it and why they should own it. And the vast majority of people know this. And so we can put together those kind of coalitions. And the last few years have shown us, the potential, just the beginning of what it might look like if people turned around and accepted that the way to resolve the frustrations in their lives was to direct the anger upwards instead of down, instead of towards people on welfare or people who are from a different racial group or people who are transgender or whatever else. If we can unite people and direct the anger upwards, well, then we have a chance of changing things. If we don't and we allow the kind of fragmentation and disintegration of the left in the coming years into all of its various groupings, well, then I think all of our struggles will be weaker.
Right. And it's very interesting to me from just even my experience, going to these demonstrations. It's like the conversation in media and online, which is just, I'm in a very cynical place about social media completely right now. Maybe at some point we do need to take a China option. And by the way, that's a joke for those who will clip that and take it out of context. But that being said, the right wing obsesses with demonizing the protesters, telling a bunch of racist lies, but also really enjoys this narrative of the kind of like silly pedant, white, liberal paying kind of penance. And then on the other hand, there is the kind of, again, the sort of woke industry which moralizes and sort of reduces it. And I have to say, some of the experience, though, it's just so it's so matter of fact. This is expressions of profound and deep racism. Fellow citizens are being murdered by security forces. It's completely democratically unacceptable. And therefore, everybody needs to show up to stop it, period, full stop. And there's a whole ethos that flows out of that I think is actually very in tandem with the kind of mass movement you're talking about.
Yeah, I agree. When I look at that and what's happening, what I immediately think is the way in which, I know it's happened here and I've seen it happen to some degree where you are with the Black Lives Matter movement, the way in which the media has taken movements which have quite clear material and direct demands in many respects about the way in which the police are behaving, particularly towards, obviously, Black people and younger Black people in the United States, but the impunity with which police are operating, because the demands are quite general across police departments. And in America, you've got a particularly paramilitarized police force, which act almost as occupiers in working class neighborhoods in many parts of the country. How they took that and they made it about all kinds of other side issues. So here they managed to take it and make it about like popular TV shows. And are we going to pull them off the kind of services like on the BBC or whatever, because someone said a word in an episode from a TV show in the 1970s? Or, it's about, are we going to end up with taking down every statue of Churchill in the entire country or whatever? And it is a deflection tactic, because actually the right wing, and this is why the right wing focuses on the culture war and why it loves the culture war, because through the culture war, you can deflect the real and meaningful reforms that people are demanding. And if you are talking about why you can't let the police go wild and murder people with impunity, then you can go to a working class area in this country, a place where there has been the experience of the miners' struggle, and you can say, this is why we need to rein in the police, because you experienced the same thing a couple of decades ago when you were on picket lines. And there will be millions of working class people who will understand that and acknowledge that reality and say, yeah, actually, my experience of dealing with the police is much the same, that I understand that we need to rein them in, that there cannot be impunity, and that the police cannot be used in fundamentally anti-democratic and repressive ways against the population. And those demands could achieve very broad appeal. And I do think they're demands that are majoritarian demands. But what the right tries to do is to channel this all down a generation war, or channel it down into some, kind of cultural motifs, some things that can never be solved. Like in Britain, the question of whether we're going to take faulty towers off the goddamn television. I mean, stuff that just, are we going to go back over, this is the piece then. You can imagine what the comment pieces are in the papers. Oh, are we going to start going back over all of TV history and censoring it all? And then that, gins up some kind of mad reaction from older people who are like, oh, these are all my favorite shows and they're being taken off air. Whereas no one in the movement demanded any of those things. The real demands around the police violence are getting totally lost amid the culture war nonsense. That's why the right loves the culture war, and it's why we have to, where possible, try not to get sucked into it. Because the more we go into that terrain and the less we focus on the demands that actually change things in people's lives, the more we lose the political arguments. Absolutely. So, that to me is a very clear kind of lesson of recent years and the rise of these kind of culture wars, and also at the same time the rise in movements like Black Lives Matter and the huge protests you see around them, which evidences the potential for building a majoritarian position around real meaningful change.
Absolutely. So I guess final couple of minutes, what are your sort of thoughts now? We were talking a little bit before we started. Joe Biden, Keir Starmer, the standard bearers now from instead of Bernie Sanders and Jeremy Corbyn. What does that represent? And what are the sort of broader responses to it? I mean, look, I think obviously in the United States, I make no secret, I think it would be very much better if Joe Biden was president versus Donald Trump. I think there's a number of reasons for that, but obviously that doesn't represent any sort of left victory whatsoever.
I would agree. I think Keir Starmer would be much better than Boris Johnson. I'm a member of the Labour Party. If an election, which it won't be, but if an election was to be called at any stage soon, I would be out there campaigning to try to make Keir Starmer Prime Minister. But I agree with the fundamental point that you raised, which is that it doesn't necessarily mean much for the left. Insofar as I see it, what we have in both countries is a very similar response to the kind of rising left and this rise of the populist right. You've now got centrist, middle-of-the-road figures who are trying to present themselves as a safer pair of hands. I think Starmer is much more competent at it, much better at it than Joe Biden is, and I think he'll be a more viable candidate going forward. But both of them are fundamentally responding to the turmoil of the last few years with political messages that say, you can trust us, we're a safer pair of hands. Both of them operate on a kind of, with a bit of nostalgia there as well, nostalgia for the status quo ante before the populist right kind of grew. So Biden obviously has the Obama link, but Starmer as well, because of his involvement with the Remain campaign and this idea, the ideas that were really so strong line before 2016 and the Brexit vote, and that just created this kind of chaos. The Brexit vote itself created a chaos from which, it was very difficult for us to return. So I think both of them operate around a kind of a nostalgia for the recent past. Both of them are saying fundamentally that what they are is a safe pair of hands after the years of turmoil with the populist right and with the rise of the socialist left. And they're saying, you can trust us to manage this, run this ship and so forth. And they're putting forward much more moderate proposals, but also their whole way of dealing with politics. They're returning to some of, the discourse that was there beforehand, where it's all about kind of, let's find the middle here between these two forces. Let's be reasonable, responsible, or what Starmer, the term he uses, sensible opposition and so on. And I think in one sense, it might work. Electorally, in the short term, I can see a path where one or both of them win. The problem is, even if they do win, it's of very little use for the left. It's better than the populist right being in power, no question about that, but it's of very little use for the goals that we have about fundamental structural change, because you can't really do much about fundamental structural change to society if you've won on the basis of I'm a safe pair of hands who's going to go back to how things were just before the populist right got into power. And, you can trust me not to cause too much disruption to your economy. That message doesn't work with fundamental structural change. And I also think, and this is my perspective on the coming decade, I think it's going to be quite hot. I think we're going to start it with a historic recession. The political disintegration that we've seen over recent years doesn't really show any sign of stopping. I think that even if there's a kind of temporary period where there's some respite for the political centre, that they'll soon find that the underlying economic conditions that created the rise of the left and the rise of the populist right are still there. And, if they try to pursue too much of a middle road, a middle ground through all this, I think they'll melt with the heat of the political situation. I think even if they got into power and they tried to sit in the middle of the road, that they would very swiftly find that the economy you can only really govern as a centrist in periods of high growth with quite widespread popularity in terms of the economy, people quite satisfied with their positions. You can't govern as a centrist in a period of tremendous economic disruption, huge numbers of people deeply unhappy with the economic situation, large levels of poverty, deep inequality. You can't govern as a centrist very easily that way. And so I think they would, even if they were to win, they would find the economic circumstances would impose themselves on them, and the left would get chances again.
That makes perfect sense. All right, Ronan Burton Shaw, really appreciate your time. As always, everybody go subscribe to Tribune. You can read great columnists there, including, of course, Ronan himself, and also Grace Blakely, who's been on the shows. Definitely someone to follow as well. Ronan, really appreciate your time, brother.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And I'll reiterate, Ronan does an incredible job with Tribune, and I read it with daily. I read that with daily. Tribune's excellent. Like, they just even had this great piece on anti-colonial struggle, labor organizing in Myanmar. They just did a great retrospective on Walter Rodney, how Europe underdeveloped Africa, who was a great, incredible assassinated Ghanaian, Ghanaian. What is the word? I'm having a total dyslexic freeze. He's from Guyana. And he was an activist and intellectual. So Tribune does great work. Check it out. Subscribe. Now it's time for an edition of the Debunk with Ben Burgis. Is Ben Burgis around? I know Matt is not around. David, I can't hear you.
Ben is not around yet. If you can hear me.
Let me see where Ben is.
Yeah, we're still
my
getting
video. I don't know what's going on with my video.
Your video is just out.
Does my audio sound okay?
Your audio sounds great, but we can't.
Okay, I also can't see you guys either. I can see you on the preview in YouTube Studio, but not in Zoom, which is very strange.
Yeah, that's weird.
Let's see.
Well, it looks like AOC got, won out pretty well so far. That's the only big result.
I thought it's looking like good news for Jamal Bowman taking out Elliot Engel. That's looking like a good result.
No, he looked real strong in the first, but we're still like so small right now. I think it's like less than 1%, but yeah, he came out strong. I don't know. I think like we're learning that we're not going to be getting results quickly from any of these races anymore.
Yeah. Obviously, we're also keeping an eye on Isaiah James and Lauren Ashcroft. We'll see. We don't know.
Here's Ben.
Yeah, we're gonna actually, when Ben after the debunk, we're gonna go over some more election results for sure. But I think Bowman's looking good. AOC is gonna get reelected, so some good news so far. Joining us now is the debunkinator himself, Ben Burgis. He's of course author of "Give Them an Argument: Logic for the Left." He's author of an upcoming great book called "Canceling Comedians While the World Burns," which I've been reading drafts of. It's just fantastic. And co-host of Dead Pundit Society. He's got a really good Patreon page. Ben, how are you?
I'm good, brother. How are you?
I'm doing all right, man. Hanging in. Are you still on the road?
Yeah, we're in Michigan. My wife and I are here spending a little bit of time with my parents. They were actually gone for the first 2 weeks while we were here, so that, make sure nobody had the plague. But they're back now, so yeah, everything's been pretty good.
Cool.
Ran a little over 4 miles last night. That's good.
Nice. You are really crushing it on the running regimen.
Tried.
You are. No, it's great. I mean, you've been tracking it. I love it. So Ben, what are we debunking tonight? This one is disingenuity of the highest order.
Yeah. So the Cato Institute put out a tweet, which is awesome. Like, because you think, all right, well, like you think about the range of things that that libertarians have said, given everything that's been going on lately, the police brutality uprising, and the range of responses has sort of gone from like people like Radley Balko or some of the authors of at Reason, who have some like useful things to say because they actually don't like cops, but like they also have like insane ideas about how to solve the problem, privatization, etc. That would make things 100 times worse, to like the sort of libertarians who who have only taken an interest in it to fret about the property rights of owners of businesses with smashed windows. But Cato Institute, they want to be clear, right? They're the woke libertarians. So what they say in this tweet, which is just kind of awesome.
Do we have the tweet up?
In its brazenness, is the abolition of slavery in the 20th century civil rights movement was a quintessentially libertarian moment. After all, it was a movement that prioritized the rights of individuals over the oppressive nature of government. So this is kind of a layer cake of bad reasoning and historical revisionism. So maybe to start with the least significant part of this, like it's a little unclear what point they're trying to make. Are they like patting themselves on the back for being retroactively opposed to slavery? Which if right. So, yeah, I mean, I would hope so, right? Like I would just think that would be a baseline for any political ideology in the 21st century, that, we've like, whatever else we're still fighting about, we all kind of agree that slavery was bad. And if when they say it's a quintessentially libertarian thing, abolishing slavery, well, if all they mean is like libertarianism, like every other contemporary political ideology, comes down to the side of slavery is bad, right? Therefore, the abolition of it was a libertarian thing. The problem is, of course, that would also make it, a socialist thing. Socialists think slavery was bad. It would make it a centrist thing because centrists think slavery was bad. And so saying like, the category of people who think slavery was bad includes libertarianism, therefore it's quintessentially libertarian. It's just to be a complete nerd about this for a second, that's the fallacy of the undistributed middle. It's like saying that since all dogs are mammals, and all cats are mammals, then all cats are dogs, right? It's just stupid on that level, right? But then also, if you go to the article, and I'm not recommending that anybody spend their time this way, but if you do, right, then what you'll find is a lot of stuff where they basically say like anybody in the 19th century who used the phrase natural rights was basically a proto-libertarian because they talk that way. And of course, look, we could some other time do a deep dive on the history of philosophical liberalism, some strands of which inform libertarianism, some strands of which inform, the kind of liberalism that we all mean when we say that liberalism sucks. some strands of which are actually very congenial to socialism, right? It's a long, complicated history. But also, more to the point and more immediately, defenders of slavery also use that language. So if you're going to say that you get some sort of retroactive credit for the fact that abolitionists talk this way, then you also have to, get into the fact that antebellum slavery apologists talk this way.
Right.
Very much so. Read the founding documents of the Confederacy. But then, also, at the next layer up, look at the reason they give for saying that it's quintessentially libertarian. And by the way, if we're going to talk about what somebody thought in the 19th century, well, calling anybody in the 19th century a libertarian is a little bit anachronistic because, that's really not something that developed in the form we know it now until a little bit later. You know what did exist in the 19th century? Marxism. Karl Marx, in fact, existed in the 19th century and was an enthusiastic supporter of the struggle against slavery. There was a former member of the Communist League with him in Germany, August Willich, who was a general in the Union Army during the Civil War. There were tons of German socialist emigres, in the Union Army. So again, if we're going to play that game, which is a pretty stupid game, I think we win. But beyond that,
you win all games, stupid and otherwise.
Yes. Yeah, the reason it's the 90s Chicago Bulls, absolutely.
That's right.
But also, the reason they give for saying this is quintessentially libertarian is that it's prioritizing the rights of individuals over the power of the government, which is real confusing because if you recall how slavery worked, slaves were not by and large owned by the government, right? Slaves were owned by private individuals. So actually, right? If you're going to win in Rome, right? When speaking to libertarians, say, what abolitionism was opposing a certain private property claim that, and you could say, but that property regime was enforced by the government, but so what? So is modern capitalism. Right? All property regimes that ever exist are enforced by the government. So if you're going to say that anytime a property regime is enforced by the state, that it's like opposing it as opposing the state, then libertarians are going to get real confused about where to come down now, right, on contemporary economic debates. And in fact, if you want to pull up the clip for the outline, because remember, there are two examples of this tweet. One is about slavery, and the other is about the civil rights movement. And now the civil rights movement, again, lots of socialists and communists in the civil rights movement, right? In fact, I would go so far as to say that any history of the civil rights movement that writes out all the socialist and communist involvement is a sanitized fairy tale, right? That was a huge part of that history. Not a lot of involvement by libertarians, and there were definitely some libertarians by then. Milton Friedman, for example, existed then, and he supported Barry Goldwater. But maybe libertarians have learned, right? It's been a long time since the civil rights movement, and that brings us to this gentleman here, who's one of the most prominent. Sometimes he calls himself a libertarian Republican, but he's somebody who is generally considered one of the leading lights of contemporary mainstream libertarianism.
Amendment as well.
Should Woolworth lunch counters should have been allowed to stay segregated? Sir, just yes or no?
What I think would happen, what I'm saying is that I don't believe in any discrimination. I don't believe that any private property should discriminate either. And I wouldn't attend, wouldn't support, wouldn't go to. But what you have to answer when you answer this point of view, which is an abstract, obscure conversation from 1964 that you want to bring up, but if you want to answer it, you have to say then that you decide the rules for all restaurants, and then do you decide that you want to allow them to carry weapons into restaurants?
So, 2012, Rand Paul is being extremely evasive when asked this esoteric question about whether Woolworth lunch counters, which were the site of classic civil rights sit-ins, this huge part of that history, should in fact have been allowed to continue to discriminate against Black customers. And I didn't hear an answer anywhere in there.
Over 40 years later, do you support the Civil Rights Act is not asking somebody to define the golden mean. This is not an esoteric question. This is, and what's also great and depressing, because it, reinforces how historically illiterate the country is. Like, this was one of the arguments by American Jim Crow forces. It wasn't just, there's actually a decent movie called All the Way. And one of the reasons that it's not bad is that they even show you that, like, the main, like, antagonist, the main villain in the Senate, Russell from Georgia, is very conscious and saying, like, to the other, like Hicks and thugs, like, no, don't use that kind of rhetoric. There's even one line, and of course he's, like, we have a PR battle to win. So even back then, we remember, the most obvious villains, and we remember the Klan and the terrorists and Strom Thurmond and, these disgusting, snarling people attacking people at counters. But there was even then plenty of people who said, like, I understand that it hasn't always been right. I think that we need to be better. Barry Goldwater explicitly in 1964 ran on this type of campaign, that segregation is a wrong, but we cannot give the federal government this sort of power. So, like, not only is this not esoteric, this is a major current of the argument against civil rights. And it also goes back to and it's funny because you said, like, most people oppose slavery today. I mean, I have toiled enough hours in the beginning, or whatever it was, the beginning of my career, the Majority Report, and I've heard enough libertarian debates to know that we do not all oppose slavery. And I think that, and that basic history of, like, a revolution that's predicated on state autonomy versus a change that happens in the Civil War that shifts with the 14th and 15th Amendments for certain sanctified rights for each individual. That really is the shift. And ironically, for all of the, language of individualism, this is a states' rights tradition, and not in, like, the sort of, cool localism, have some discretion sense, which I support, but the actual full bona fide federal government cannot stop me from practicing apartheid variety. So
yeah,
fuck the Cato Institute.
Absolutely, right. And actually, and yes, right, that is a fair point. I think that, like, the sort of slavery, where you're born into slavery, it's racialized like that. I think, God knows, I would not be surprised if some lunatic who called H.R. Sam Cedar, still defends that, right?
Well, no, they would say it wasn't right, but, a state should be able to do it.
Yeah, right. And actually, even beyond that, right? Robert Nozick, is one of the most important libertarian philosophers of the 20th century, right? His book about libertarianism, Anarchy, State, Utopia, is taught in college classes all over the place. And it's like one footnote somewhere or something, but in it, he does embrace the idea that that slavery that results from a voluntary contract, would be fine, right? Like he says that,
those old voluntary contract slavery deals. Absolutely. Well, unfortunately, there's a big line of people that do want to turn absolutely everything into life into a contract, from libertarians to liberals to technocrats. But we will fight on. Ben Burgis, thank you for the debunk, brother.
All right. Thank you, Michael.
Appreciate it. Matt, what's the technical status, bro?
So it seems like I can talk to you guys, but I just
Yeah, you
can't
can
see
talk.
you, or you can't see me. So
That is so wild. Things are starting to open up here. Have
I
you
think it's
noticed
going to be
that?
going to be a brief opening, if I had to guess.
You think so?
I think I've always been a doomer on this stuff, and I think stuff's going to hit the fan again pretty soon. But I mean, I snuck away out to Rhode Island, looked at some beaches, popped a tire, had to change it,
Nice.
but it was
Ooh.
nice to get out of the city, definitely, and the freeways were wide open. And we drove past a bunch of bars that were open, and you can go in there and it's like everything's spaced out, but half people aren't wearing masks. But Rhode Island is it was interesting because way less people are wearing masks than in New York, but it's still the Northeast, so you get a bit of that. But I think it's all going to hit the fan again soon.
I don't want to be putting out bad vibes, but like I read a piece in FT the other day about how South Korea is having all of these problems reopening, and it's like if they're having problems reopening, we're fucked. I mean, there's
simple.
nothing else to say. It's just like a place that did apparently by every metric we can measure, they basically did everything right.
Yeah.
We're doing everything wrong up to like the fucking president telling people not wear masks, and we have no real public health infrastructure.
It's like you have a basketball matchup with a team, and then the day before you see them just toast the 2013 Miami Heat. And it's like, well,
yeah, no, it's just it's bad stuff. Do we have I'm gonna just do this riff for a few minutes, but then we got some stuff about. I don't know if I saw all the added sounds, but I know we've got stuff from the Trump rally and some other stuff like that. But I want to just and actually, David, I dropped this in the outline. I might ask you to pull it up. It's a PBS article. So I've been trying to make part of what this show does have be an intelligent conversation about China. I don't think that really exists in media. And this is in a really, really, really important time for that conversation to the extent it's humanly possible, because the consensus, the sort of American bipartisan consensus, has been basically coming apart on China aggressively under Trump, but arguably since 2014 and Obama's pivot to Asia. That this notion, and I would go back and watch the video on the history of permanent normalized trade relations with China, that this notion that we're going to basically have this agreement, cheap goods, cheap current, that America will invest, China will rapidly industrialize, and then in exchange, stock Walmart and other kind of cheap goods centers for us. That'll be the sort of quote unquote win-win, though it certainly has not worked overall at all for the working class of the United States. Cheap goods do not make up for high-paying unionized jobs. And there's many other reasons for the undermining of those things. It's certainly not China as a country, but part of it has been outsourcing to China. That's part of the picture of that undermining, along with deindustrialization and NAFTA and a variety of other things. And, it's quite clear that China is not going to follow this arrogant path, arrogant in the Western sense that we had assumed, which is just like, hey, everybody, builds malls and KFCs, and then they have something sort of approximating a liberal democracy. Although, of course, we are, America's foreign policymakers and corporate leaders were in no great hunger to see an independent trade union movement in China or something like that. That I can assure you. So we're at a time of really extreme tension, and again, it's not just Trump. There's a much broader mainstream discourse on being significantly more hawkish and aggressive with China. So this obviously concerns me. It concerns me because any sort of actual conflict between China and the United States is disastrous for the world. Western foreign policymakers are sort of assuming this Thucydides trap dynamic where when one power is receding and another is rising, there's usually conflict, sort of with the exception of basically Great Britain, the UK kind of handing the baton off to the United States in some respects in that sort of post-World War II period. I don't know if this is actually exactly how Chinese policymakers view things. I think they think of things much more in terms of spheres of influence. But the point is that we're in very potentially explosive and dangerous times. And also there's a lot of the usual pernicious U.S. interests that are driving it, like some of the think tanks, that are sort of fear-mongering the most on China, of course, are underwritten by, Lockheed Martin and Boeing and other aspects of the U.S. arms industry. This is another thing that we've covered. Then there's the kind of intellectual importance of trying to understand a place and how it works as best as possible. And, this is interesting to me because this does not mean demonizing, and it does not mean in any way glorifying or justifying. And frankly, I wish sometimes the left would have more of a relationship like this to the United States. No place on earth, very, very few places can be understood in completely binary, good versus evil terms. There's a lot of complexity to them. And even if in the main, it's not a project we get on board with. But in conjunction with the threats of conflict around China and a desire to sort of understand China better, I've seen rhetoric, like even from people like Matt Stoller. Matt Stoller actually does a lot of good work. He compared China to Nazi Germany. That's extraordinary rhetoric. And frankly, once, as Daniel Bessner's pointed out, once you start evoking Nazi comparisons, there really isn't a lot of policy options, because that is foundational existential evil, right? It's and it overrides, a lot of other really, really important diplomatic and political processes that we need to have with China. Now, part of this has been trying to get a more detailed understanding of things like what are happening in Xinjiang. And I definitely think that it is correct and smart to have a critical analysis of sort of agreed upon human rights narratives. They've definitely been weaponized for US foreign policy purposes. Now, at the same time, and the balance that I think I didn't strike recently on the majority report is you can't then go and start to sort of do PR or excuse making for China as an example. So I think if we're going to call the detention centers that Donald Trump has at the border concentration camps, and I will, there's no question that the Uyghurs are being held in concentration camps. These are brutal things. And they're even launched as part of, a 2014 so-called People's War on Terror by Xi Jinping. All of the reporting that we can gauge, these are brutal. They are attempts at viciously erasing people's culture, their autonomy. There's numerous abuses reported, and this is really serious. It's one of the, obscene examples of abuse in the world today. And John Bolton, who, again, please God, don't buy his book. I absolutely believe that Donald Trump, had positive words about the concentration camps. Because look, there's an element of a lot of these dynamics, from China to India to the United States to, Hungary, and even some respects in Russia, where there is just a sort of like global anti-Muslim animus that drives so many of these dynamics in all of these countries, not to mention obviously Israel. And then Trump, of course, said today that the reason he didn't push on the Uyghurs is because of a trade deal is being negotiated. So I'm just trying to spell out, though, all of the variables here. And just as with the issue of Tibet, which I also, I guess, do not have a tanky position on, I don't need to romanticize preoccupation in Tibet to absolutely think and know that there's an occupation by the People's Liberation Army, and there's been radical and systemic human rights abuses in Tibet. There's no question about that. And Tibet and Xinjiang are both going to be weaponized and used cynically by U.S. foreign policymakers and neocons. And this is always the case. And frankly, what we can learn from history is that we should really err on the side of being first and foremost critical of U.S. Policy designs. Iraq is a preeminent example of this. Of course, Saddam Hussein committed all sorts of vicious abuses, but the reality was, the real action was the invasion of Iraq, and frankly, same with the Taliban. So that's what I'm trying to do. And it, like with so many things, sometimes it succeeds, sometimes it fails, but we're trying on this show to have some actual analysis, and it really doesn't lend itself to sound bites. It doesn't lend itself to stupid clips. And, I noticed this clip on the Majority Report, which I guess we should have pulled, where I sort of questioned when Jean Bajlan, in the context, by the way, of both talking about the enormous abuses in Xinjiang and Trump's cynicism, I questioned the specific use of the word concentration camp. And I regret that, and it's absolutely a concentration camp. However, there is a corner of the internet and a corner of a certain type that jumps on that type of thing to make an argument about what we're doing, which is, of course it's inaccurate, but I don't think those people are even capable of sort of figuring it out, because, trying to disaggregate between is statements and ought statements and how China works, where they have a valid perspective, their horrific systemic human rights abuses, but then also the fact that those things are weaponized and deployed by the United States. This requires a lot of work. This isn't, scurrying around Wikipedia. This isn't, using Google to try to memorize a few talking points or whatever for some silly debate. This requires actual groundwork. And so, that's what we're doing here, and that's what we'll continue to do. And I just wanted to clarify that. But I'll get off my soapbox now, guys.
I remember that, and I'm more comfortable using that sort of language, I think, than you are. But I thought it was fair enough in the moment, because I thought Gene's response actually was handling it well. But right. I understand why you addressed it now. I just thought in the moment it didn't seem flagrant to me. But even though I would say concentration camp,
it wasn't. And
it's because of the Hitler, the Bessner thing about the Nazis.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's that work. And it's also, and again, it's also looking to, and there's been some very interesting pushback on that. But I think, that's the context. And unfortunately, there's a lot of people that just don't, definitionally, they don't do context because they don't know anything, but I want to just sort of clarify that. And we're going to keep going after the difficult things. And I think what's actually paradoxical about that too is this actually requires a lot of humility, because it's difficult. If it was just hey, I found a Wikipedia entry and that's bad. It's that doesn't, okay. Anybody could figure out how to do that. But this stuff is going to require a bit, of actual analysis. And that means it isn't always going to be clean, But the intention of really trying to understand the world better, and also balance between realism and, moral clarity. I think that's another thing. I guess I've also gotten, just in general, I think the clear intentions and sentiments of dignity and justice for all is 100%. And, sitting on a soapbox and just sort of sort of hectoring forth. I don't know. That to me is just not very interesting content, because I don't even, and this is just the last thing I'll say. I talked to somebody, actually, it's so funny, a friend of mine who was, I have to be careful here, but he was involved with some aspect of advocacy on this issue in Xinjiang. deep understanding of it, and certainly understands them as I do, to just continue to be clear, as concentration camps. And he's like, yeah, but the money, like the energy behind what's pushing this in the United States is absolutely militaristic and extremely dangerous. Now, then we get into the other kind of zone of people say like, well, I mean, if it's true, it's true. You got to say what's true. And
this
again,
is exactly like
just
the radical Islam conversation.
Exactly. And so now we're back to square one. And, I think hopefully I've changed a lot in the last several years, and, putting in much better work, and, maybe even become a slightly wiser, more patient, better person, pray to God. But that is just an ongoing for me. Like, well, you gotta just say what it is. This is politics. I'm not doing, a geometry tutorial.
Mm-hmm.
All of these variables are in play. And frankly, and there is an enormous self-undermining of the Western human rights framework. I mean, no single mainline organization talked about freeing Lula as an example. And very few of them, as an example, talk about the systemic abuses and oppressions in the United States. And not because of like the same nerdy shit, like, well, what about the US? But literally, it's a credibility definer. You have to measure an institution's credibility by, if they're doing a proper analysis of everything. So anyways, that is what it is. And I guess it's also, there's some people out there that I just, I'm just not interested in, but they have a lot of obsessions. And that's my indirect answer to all of that. It's pretty boring. We'll keep trying to do real work.
Mm-hmm.
But real work is necessarily more difficult. All right, I'll shut up. Sorry.
Yeah. Well, I think that's it.
Yeah.
I mean, the only thing that I would just add is like, it's like these issues can be really difficult sometimes to speak to, just because, especially with this situation, it is so far from, the sources that we're used to being able to read and cultivate and stuff. You have to rely on a lot. You have to rely on a lot of different people and a lot of different information. And my only advice would be is like, you have to understand that you just can't have these kind of simplistic narratives. Like, even the way that people talk about China as like one unified force is ridiculous on an analytic level, right? I mean, China is a massive country with significantly different social forces. Now, there's a lot of political concentration and power, but even that concentration isn't like, singularly held. It's held by a lot of different forces. And I'm not saying I understand all of those. I'm just saying, like, when you jump into, an area of the world that you're not super familiar with, you'd really have to come in there with like a level of humility. That means
Absolutely.
Sometimes that you're just not going to be able to jump in. And as you were saying, I think the specific point that you made was like that you just can't go and read a Wikipedia article or like learn a couple talking points and act like you understand something. I like that the idea of what we're trying to do here is very humble, in the sense that like we just can't jump in and say that we know everything, that we're just going to continue to to rely on people that we can and our own research and things like that, to be able to have serious conversations instead of just headline nonsense, because there's so many different social forces.
That's really it. And again, it isn't like, yeah. And I'll leave it at that. I think that's exactly right. That's exactly right. And I'm not suggesting that this situation is like that, but there was a time when, WMD in Iraq, if you question that, you were insane. Well, being insane was right. All right, let me take a few quick Discord questions, and then we'll get to a few more. Dave from Jamaica, what can we effectively do to pressure China on the issue of the Uyghurs? This is interesting. So I have no doubt that like global press attention is not welcome and not desired. So I think there's basic value in any area of crisis, right? To like the way Cornel West does it. I mean, Cornel West will say he'll do as much on the list as he can, right? Palestinian, Tibetan, Uyghurs, of course, all the people in the United States, everywhere. So I think highlighting it is important. But I also think, and this is another, there's this guy Khalid who does these videos that I'm sure, you know, if people would find very provocative, but the point that he made, he one video, and he's of Palestinian descent, and he made one video where he's just like, stop, like, I don't, like, yes, Palestine, horrific, one of the worst human rights violations in the world, and US leftists, like, you know, if you put all of your energy into trying to elect Bernie, that would do infinitely more for me and my family than a million placards about the plight of Palestinians, right? Now, whatever, we can adjudicate the particular details of this, but I think this is another very interesting thing that's worth interrogating, because we came up and the left had absolutely no power. And there were some things, and I think it's, you know, again, it can be different in like the Western system. There's more pressure that can be applied on Israel than China. Although even that is changing, because with the sort of emergence of the right, Israel's PR concerns are totally diminishing. And that's what a lot of this comes down to. Like even the dismantling of apartheid, there was this huge, like, we can't play in international sports anymore. It's embarrassing. But we came up and it was like, there's no power, there's no structure, there's nothing, there isn't anything. So we can have these like small agitation campaigns for, you know, absolutely correct and worthy causes, like things that are 100% morally in the right, freeing Palestine. But they were not projects of actually grabbing power. And we're still at this point. And some of it, of course, I've said a million times, will continue to say, I think that sense of powerlessness actually manifests in these extraordinarily ugly and disgusting and disturbing and toxic directions online. And actually, Amber Frost and Matt Christman have a great conversation on this on Jacobin. But even things that are actually great, and I'm completely on board with, and I will highlight, don't necessarily have the building blocks of power. Of getting power. So the kind of indirect question is like, if we want to actually help the Uyghurs, how do we get power in the United States for the kind of government that would actually have the well-being of all at the forefront? You know, those actually have to be the restating questions. Mm-hmm. Other than, I think, talking about it and highlighting it, and if there's various practical ways of protecting people that are refugees and preserving culture and so on. I think, of course, if you're moved to do that, you absolutely should do that. And we're going to have a conversation on this soon with a good guest. But I think what Hala did there, that's a very powerful reframed question, at least in that regard.
Yeah, I mean, I just piggybacking off of that, I think that's exactly right. And I want to be careful so people don't misunderstand what I'm saying. I'm not saying that it's an either or conversation, right? Like, knowledge is very important. But, you know, on the stream that I did last week on, you know, left pessimism, I was talking about, you know, this kind of fetishization that some people, the kind of individualism that people do in response to, like, oh man, there's so much injustice in the world, right? I'm just going to sort of like bear witness to everything. And like, that's my contribution, right? And I'm not saying don't pay attention to what's going on in the rest of the world. That's not what I'm saying at all. But like, you can't fetishize that in itself, right? You actually do need to start asking yourself questions like, well, how do we build power, and how can I build power around me? I think that's exactly right. That's the second level thing that we need to do, because there's so much of, you know, like, awareness is like a very crucial first step for a lot of things. But at a certain point, like, we're aware of a lot. And until we're able to be empowered to change it, you know, it won't get changed. Now, you know, at the same time, if we're not aware of it, then we can't do anything about it. So that's an important part of the project as well. But there's been so much weight, I think, on the awareness for some people, because it's easier to do sometimes than taking power, if that makes sense.
Well, and absolutely. And I mean, the left has been, to the extent it's even existed, kind of like the sort of, you know, playing that conscience role, and ultimately that isn't going to get us to power. Did Nation of Islam Obama have any thoughts on the kente cloth? It's like, I had no idea that Chuck and Nancy watched Coming to America. What a fucking joke. But if you want to do something substantive, I want 2/3 of the Morgan Stanley board to be from the nation. Let's see. Question. In Canada, the reevaluation of need police and the role that they play in society is taking place as well. However, I'm finding even among the circles of friends that would usually openly talk of Marxist theory, they're falling prey to framing arguments and policy proposals in purely identitarian fashion. I even had to standpoint epistemology argument thrown at me, despite being the only radical person in the group, e.g., who should only be allowed to speak. I don't think these naturally rising movements need vanguards to lead them. Are there any specific books and articles you recommend that point people to argue for a more universalist? Read William Shockey's piece. That's why we had him on. I mean, that the thing that I find fascinating by some contingents of the left in South Africa is that they're ahead of us in terms of the policy implications of these things. And you got to go back to class. You have to. I mean, there's just no way of handling this stuff in a systemic fashion. And even and it's incredible, like the tendencies that flip from, and I do think part of this is a product of online toxicity, of like the humility, the idea that of course one's life experience has mediated, and like, don't be arrogant, shut the fuck up when certain people, as an example, are talking about their own life experience. But then conversely, when we're actually talking about politics and policy sets, I'm sorry, that just needs to be thrown out. That it cannot be the mediator. All right, let's do what do we got sound wise?
So we have Trump making fun of himself for his ramp stuff from the rally. We have this interview with Evo.
Let's do a little Trump and a little Evo.
Okay. I'll pull
Let's start with Donald Trump. So Donald Trump, of course, not good. Had a very bad rally. Very low attendance. He still went out and riffed. And we got here are some of his riffs.
So what happens is I start the journey inch by inch, right? And I was really bent over, too. I didn't like that. I didn't like this picture. This picture, I'm sure, will be an ad by the fakers. So I was bent over, right? And I go like this. And then we finally reached almost the end. And the fake news, the most dishonest human beings, they cut it off. You know why? Because when I was 10 feet short, I said, General, I'm sorry, and I ran down the rest, right? I looked very handsome. That was the only good thing. I wouldn't want to run down the whole thing because the fall there would be definitely bad. So I took these little steps. I ran down the last 10. And by the way, their tape, take a look. In almost every instance, it ends just before I run. And they said, here was the #1 trending story. I called my wife. I said, how good was that speech? I thought it was hey, look, I will tell you when I make good ones and bad ones. Like so far tonight, I'm average.
Is there video evidence?
Is there any video evidence of the sprint?
I mean, that's what a thing to brag about, too. Honestly, that's like what little kids do sometimes. Like at the end of the stairs, they hop the last like 4. I don't know. I didn't see much of the rally other than that, and I also saw him drinking the water.
Do we have the water?
I can find it in a second.
I'll just say this though. He's losing his instincts.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, because I really do think, like in 2016, when we look back at it, and of course there was, of course there was the viciousness, the racism, the xenophobia, the demagoguery, but he really was cooking with broad anti-establishment talking points. I mean, he was bullshitting, and as I always say, I mean, I think part of the reason he can't bullshit in the same way is because he wasn't coming out of, he spent the last several years giving rich people money, trying to gut healthcare. He's a Republican, he's a plutocrat, but so he doesn't have, but at the same time, I mean, he's a fucking liar. So even though he's done all of that, he could still be lying about wanting to give people healthcare and lying about the corporate elites. But he's kind of just, some of it's funny, like that was a good riff, but he's just sort of like it. He weaved his narcissism and his demagoguery with the populism last time. Now it's all just demagoguery and narcissism. And even stuff like, it doesn't even register. I think the fact that what do you say? People should get a year in prison for burning a flag. Like, yeah, I think just a complete naked attack on the First Amendment should probably warrant a little bit more attention. But at any rate, I think his instincts are off, and I think that was a good riff, but I thought it was a pretty sad and pathetic rally. Look, I think he's not going to get reelected.
No, that's why. He's begging Joe Biden for more debates, which is a total loser move because debates are for nerds. And right. He's completely panicked. The thing is like he accused Obama of treason. Like he's like, the reporter's like, well, what would you call it? It's like, how about treason? And it doesn't really even move the needle anymore. He's been doing this for too long that like nobody's surprised. He's got no more, like, I don't know. It's gonna take something beyond his efforts to make him be president again.
Right.
I mean, I go back and forth on this. I mean, I don't think it's particularly novel to say, but if this virus basically stops him being able to hold these mega rallies, then he's toast. I absolutely agree. And I mean, it looks like that's going to be the case. I will say, like, I'll put this on real quick. When I saw this, I will say it was Saturday night, and maybe it was because I had a couple of beers, but I was pretty convinced that Donald Trump was going to be president again. just because it's so he gets a standing ovation.
His hands still look small.
But also I gotta say, like, compared to the Rubio move, I mean, that's funny, but I can only think of the Rubio move when he does that.
Yeah.
Find the Rubio. That's the Rubio thing is one of the funniest things that ever happened. What?
Oh, when Trump made fun of him for drinking water.
Yes, Trump impersonating Rubio drinking water.
The apogee.
Yeah, Trump not having like the Republicans to run against too, like he did originally.
Or Hillary Clinton.
And Hillary. That's a very good point. That 1-2 punch of like being able to beat up on Republicans, which was honestly one of the greatest political seasons I've ever gone through.
It's fucking beautiful.
Then just going against Hillary, who had in like 20 years of just like right-wing propaganda infrastructure built up against her. Like, he doesn't have that now.
Yeah.
No, he doesn't. And I mean, and it's funny because, like, I think I was always pretty clear that Biden, again, this isn't is versus ought statements. Biden was probably a pretty strong candidate. I still think, of course, I think Bernie would be a stronger one, and it's a fucking world historic tragedy he isn't the nominee. But there is like a weird, I mean, Bernie, it would have rolled off on him because Bernie just has like a singularity of purpose. Like, I don't have time for your bullshit. I'm getting people's healthcare. But Biden sort of has the same, like, Biden's just like, I'm too fucking senile to even notice what you said. Like, whatever. Like, Biden's got his own, like, Biden's like, dude, I haven't even left my basement. I'm leading you by double digits. Like,
yeah,
you're like, you're trying to pull up on me. Like, we don't even do like streams properly, and I'm kicking your ass.
Yeah.
Like, whatever. Yeah, all right. This is vintage.
Get this Rubio.
Yes, please.
Marco on to refute President Obama's speech. Do you remember that catastrophe? And he's like this, and we were, I need water, help me, I need water, help. And this is on live television. This total joke artist.
This is so ridiculous.
It's Rubio.
No, that's a different character. I hear you.
Oh, that's just, I mean, come on. Like, I can drink a glass of water and prove that I wasn't having a stroke. Okay. That was like genuine. I mean, that was just like some of the funniest stuff happening. Like, that was genuinely hysterical.
Well, because at that time, I was fairly confident that Hillary would probably beat Bernie, but at least like they'd beat the Republican because Trump is crushing all the Republicans. Although, you know, I do remember when we played that Keith Ellison thing. Also, I don't know, like there were signs. Like I remember having those conversations. Like, are we like in Weimar Germany before Hitler and laughing at this? But I don't know.
Totally. But Hitler was probably never as funny.
Probably not.
Probably not. Let's guys, let's check in. We got any more results?
It looks like Booker is up over McGrath.
Oh, that's great.
Decent, but from in-person voting, most of the vote isn't in person though. So of course, you know, this is one of the things about.
But he's up now.
Let's see. That's what I had heard. Let me confirm.
You know, I mean, like, you know, that's the reality though. It's like, it's going to be really slow coming in, but it seems that like Booker had some pretty interesting results.
Yeah, I guess I was reading something wrong.
Yeah, there's some older stuff too. Like, you know, cities are going to take longer to come out in Kentucky. It's like 50%. McGrath still has like a lead, and
but it looks like, I mean, Bowman, I think, is going to take Engel.
Bowman looks really good.
That's
AOC
great.
won big.
AOC won big. Bowman looking good. I don't know. All right. Well, those are the good signals so far.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like we really are just like at a period of time where it's gonna be hard to do instant results now.
Absolutely.
As we remember from even the primaries before coronavirus, I didn't do elections like y'all did, but they just seem to go on forever.
Yeah.
Forever. Jesus Christ.
If people have time, they should, especially for these upcoming elections, volunteer to be a poll watcher or election volunteer, because it might be interesting to just historically, talking about bearing witness. That might be a good vantage point to see democracy, whether it crumbles or not in front of our eyes.
Yeah. Let's see.
The system here was horrible.
What?
Like in New York, this absentee system was terrible.
I didn't get my absentee ballot.
A lot of people didn't get theirs. I got mine like the day before. I voted in person though, just because of that. But I know pretty much everyone I talked to didn't get their absentee ballot. I don't know. It's just like, it's very frustrating to see how incapable we are in this country of doing democracy.
Incapable and unwilling.
Incapable and unwilling. There's a request. I will follow up on this with Joshua Kahn Russell. He will be back next weekend. Next Tuesday. That's a good one. All right. Current pandemic and economic fallout for workers. Is it possible to start translating some of the energy of the current protests into a global labor movement? If not, what are some of the challenges you think might be present? If possible, what do you think the character of the global will look like post-pandemic? Is this working? That is, if the working class is successful in making some gains and fighting for economic and political equity. Well, I think it's absolutely essential that, you know, I mean, we've been talking about this all day, that in my view, that even to do the seriously radical things that must be done on policing are completely inseparable from the global public goods agenda. Inseparable. So I have no doubt that there's things being learned. There's important conversations being had, but I also, I'm very concerned about the directions things are going in. I can't lie. I think as far as what things would actually look like if there was some achievements, I think if there was achievements in the I think a real substantive achievement in the United States, if America had universal health care, to me, single payer, that would be the biggest signal that something had actually happened.
Mm-hmm. Question is, so broad. It's hard to give a direct answer, but we are in a moment where like articulating these demands is going to be an additional set of struggle. I think we've talked about this a lot in the street. It becomes very clear, but in the outside of that world, you see the co-option going on from corporations. Kimberly Crenshaw, for example, the New York Times, saying that like, look, the corporations are ahead of the left in the United States. Shows the kind of political fights that we have to have right now.
It also
right?
shows that maybe people shouldn't have complained so much about Adolph Reed's critique.
Oh, I would agree. Yeah.
Of course we would agree, but again, like that's it right there. That's, I don't want to kind of endlessly sort of litigate these things, but yes, Kimberly Crenshaw did say that. And I would say really specifically, like from the perspective of that politics, which is middle-class liberalism, that's correct. Mm-hmm. Right. But if you want to get into the underlying class redistributive agenda that, as Shockey was, demonstrating, is just inseparable from it, you have to go there. I also, in my experience, I think the demands on the streets are definitely multitude. I think there's a lot of different things happening on the streets. Like, I don't,
I absolutely agree.
Yeah.
But, what I'm saying is that like it seems a lot more possible there than it does in like the national narrative conversation, right? Because there's so many mediating factors that happen on that level versus street level. Look, there's been a lot of look, there's a video for everything, right? We've seen, people going on, like Black Republicans going on telling people we love the police, and that really challenges.
Yeah, don't share. Those videos are ops in general.
Oh, of course.
I wouldn't base it off of that.
Like, there's a video for every like perspective or agenda out there on the street. But I'm saying like on the aggregate, just the nature of like mass demonstrations, it pushes those off to the sides, which is why they have to exist as videos, because they can only exist out of context. Right.
Absolutely.
So that's the political fight that we're in, is making sure that like we don't lose that, like the narrative or the ability to interpret what's happening. But no, I think there's a part of us that really needs to be excited and mobilized. There's part of us that needs to be real about what these are, and then there's a part of us that should be worried that they're going to be captured to maintain a project that really that's doomed.
And I think we have to sit and keep thinking about what will be, the most effective vehicle to and I don't think, Sanders was clear. I don't, it's not clear yet what that is. It's clear what's important and what's, what people are risking their lives for and what people are doing. And so that's why we've been there. But the actual like strategic path is not clear yet. Again, I still keep going back to labor because I just, even just purely because of the numbers, in terms of assembling that literal amounts of people, All right, let's do a couple of clips from this before we sign off. Can you set this up? This is Evo Morales, who of course was deposed in a coup in Bolivia this past October. He's been in exile ever since. There's ongoing and serious mobilization organizations amongst labor, amongst the movements for socialism inside Bolivia, resisting the coup government that is running Bolivia, and of course backed by United States and other parts of the Western world. But Evo Morales is the legitimate democratic president of Bolivia, and he represents something much, even larger than that specific title. And tell us about this conversation, Dave.
Yeah, this was just an interesting conversation that was hosted by the Communist Party of Canada along with a host of indigenous leaders in Canada as well, that they had with Evo. And, I pulled a little clip from it. I highly suggest it if y'all have the time or interested to check it out. Maybe I'll put it up on Twitter after this. Anyways, the clip is really great. The only thing that's a little bit wonky is because they had to do like live translations. He has to stop in the middle. So I can sort of set up, it's going to be a minute of a translator saying what Evo had just said. But before that, he had been talking, about the fight within Bolivia and, how much of a like anti-indigenous coup that this was, and the kind of sentiment that was going on. And here he's sort of talking about what they did, what his democratic movement did in Bolivia, and also why it was such a threat to the white power structure of Bolivia.
Unfortunately, some groups that represent the high class have said the following: we study to dominate and rule over the indigenous people. Why? We showed them how to rule a country. We showed them how to increase our economy, how to decrease inequality, how to decrease poverty. That was the result of our democratic and cultural revolution. You know what they used to sing? They used to sing Lamento Boliviano, the Bolivian cry. They used to make us read the sick country, El Pueblo Enfermo. They used to say that Bolivia was dying if it was not to follow neoliberal strategies. But us, the indigenous movements, social movements, along with other professionals, showed them that a different Bolivia was possible. Without the need of the IMF or the ATPDA, we were able to do it. We were able to nationalize our natural resources, take back our raw materials. We started to industrialize lithium. And after that is when the coup came. Because when we started to industrialize lithium, we said we would do so without the help of the United States. A Republican senator in the United States said not too long ago, the coup was supported by Donald Trump for the simple reason of the lithium.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, that's 100%, accurate. And, I would also add that, Inez has now said that they will hold elections on September 6th. We'll see how, genuine she is about the pledge now. And also if she's going to, try to prevent Moss, Evo's party, from being able to participate, fully in those elections. And, I just wanted to add, because I haven't actually seen much coverage in the U.S. press. The only things I've seen in English, have been like Buenos Aires Times and things from the AAP. If people do analyze this, let's make sure to remind them that it was only because of the threat of mass social movements and labor movements against the current coup government that forced them to hold elections, because they were not going to do that without the kind of immense social pressures that, basically have started to develop over the past couple of weeks against their refusal to hold elections.
Absolutely. So solidarity and friendship there. All right, folks, we're going to wrap up. This Sunday, Joanna Wiest is going to be talking about the future of the rights of trans people and how it connects with labor and social movements. I'd also go back and listen to the conversation we did Beyond Intersectionality several months ago. She's brilliant. Next week, Brianna Last, she had wrote a piece in the Bellows on the class composition of DSA. We're going to talk about the class composition of DSA and also why psychological indicators are increasing or showing basically like a lack of empathy in the middle class and how that relates to, so much of this toxic environment we find ourselves in. And is there a way out from a psychotherapeutic perspective? Next week, Bill Fletcher Jr. is joining us. The week after that, Stavros is joining us. And then Robert McChesney. Pretty excited about. Thank you, Matt. Thank you, David. Thanks, everybody. Stay safe. Be well.
See you guys.
Take care, man.